I have been known to do that. Okay. All right. Well, again, welcome everybody. We are looking at two parables in the 15th chapter of Luke, as well as the first two verses of that chapter, which lay the groundwork for why Jesus told us parable. So we're looking at Luke 15, verses 1 through 10. And just before we read it, what I want to say is that I think these two parables get the shaft quite a bit because the third parable in this trilogy is the one that captures our imagination the most, and it's the one that's most well known. And of course, that's the parable of the lost son. And I indeed want to invite you always to call it the parable of the lost son, not the prodigal son, because the point of the parable is that he was lost, not that he was prodigal. And yes, he was a loser in some respects, and he made some really bad decisions in some respects. But that's not the point of the parable. Not if we read it alongside of these two parables. So we're going to try to give these two parables their due today. Okay, let's begin with prayer. Gracious God, open our hearts and minds to what your Spirit is saying through your word to us. Amen. Okay, let's just start by reading. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Which of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulder and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin I had lost." Just so I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. All right, this ends the reading. Let me start by asking you, did you have any questions about the text or the video that you wanted to make sure we mention and address today while we're together? All right. If you think of some as we go along, please feel free to say so. Verses 1 and 2 set up this whole thing, and we don't want to forget that. These are not just good stories that Jesus was holding for the right moment. These are stories that are embedded in a moment. All right. And in verses 1 and 2, you have the tax collectors and sinners in this corner, and the Pharisees and scribes in this corner, right? Um, I think it's a good practice for us not to assume too much about any of these four groups. But let me ask you, I mentioned on the video I would do this. What do you know about tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, and scribes? We've got these four groups. What do you know about them from your time of being engaged with the scriptures?
Well,
Yes, ma'am.
reading something like this, the Pharisees thought everyone was a sinner that wasn't them.
Okay.
I mean, you know,
So what Shirley knows is the Pharisees thought everyone wasn't a sinner who wasn't there.
there's some churches like that now who think, you do this, you're a sinner. So I mean, it's I keep trying to remind myself it was a different time.
Okay. So the way we think of Pharisees is a very judgmental group, more or less, right? Kind of, and we can fill in the blanks with that. Good, good. Any others? Pharisees, scribes, tax collectors, sinners.
I have to address.
Yeah, please, tax collectors, speak to that.
Why, even today, some people take offense at tax collectors. No, they were the sellouts, essentially. They were working for the Roman system and weren't known for their honesty and straightforwardness.
Right, right.
So that led right immediately to the sinners next. And what did they wear a little badge that says sinner?
A scarlet letter or something. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It always takes me, by surprise when anyone in the Gospels points to anyone else and says, "Oh, that person's a sinner," or they're a group of sinners, and the narrators do it as much as anybody, right? Tax collectors. This is Luke. Now, tax collectors and sinners were gathering around Jesus. So tax collectors. That's a great point. I'm sorry that the stink of tax collectors in the Bible has made its way toward your career. But yes, they were working, if not on behalf of, at least with the authority of the Roman Empire. And from what we think we know, they were able to extract taxes from people using the authority of the empire, and they were able to extract more than necessarily they needed, and they would pay the empire for the right to do this, and then they get to keep the excess. So you have people like Zacchaeus, who we're going to meet in 4 chapters. Chapter 19, Zacchaeus, who was the chief tax collector and apparently very wealthy. So it could be a very lucrative business, but you had to sell out your people more or less to engage in. So, going back to the Pharisees, the Old Testament law tells you not to charge interest to fellow Jews. The Old Testament law tells you not to defraud others. So the Pharisees had every reason to be and have a lot of antipathy toward the tax collector, but not because they're necessarily stuffy, but because they're trying to adhere to the law. And tax collectors certainly were in violation of that. So they are kind of, just by disposition, if nothing else, really natural enemies in some respects. All right, tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, scribes. What do we know? What's a scribe?
They write.
They write, they read, they're literate, right? We can't imagine that everybody we meet here is literate. Even people who cite the scriptures probably are working off of memory more than something they've read. I've seen estimates that less than 10% of the population in Greater Palestine during this time is probably literate, right? So anytime you have a legal matter or something that needs to be documented, whether it's land dispute or hiring contract or something, it's almost like an attorney, as it were, to help you kind of get your papers straight and make sure it's legal. So the scribes, they weren't necessarily religious figure, but because so much of the law among Jews was based on the Old Testament, they were Old Testament scholars. Does that make sense? A lot of, yes, Beryl.
I'm looking at a different version calls them teachers of the law.
Yeah, so that's a nice way of putting it. My suspicion is that, yes, both the Mosaic law as well as the Roman law, because they had to help you navigate those waters. So yeah, you can see where they'd be key and powerful people within a society that is dependent on that. I was really surprised one time. I was with a community in El Salvador that was signing an agreement with a church in Iowa to become partners. And 3 of the community leaders put an X in their thumbprint. So they needed somebody to tell them what it was they were signing and what it meant. Just think about what it's like to live in a context where you're dependent on the scribal folk and their ability to help you discern not only what the religious law says, which you find binding as much as civil law, but also the Roman civil law and all the things that go with that. Yeah. All right. But sinners, who are sinners? Turn to your neighbor and point to a sinner. No, no, no. Yeah, this is an interesting term, isn't it? Because it's not being used in this story the way that Presbyterians typically use it. Presbyterians typically use the word sinner in a way that Paul would often use the term in his letters. You might remember in Romans, Paul says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Paul will use the word sinner to describe the state of the human condition. Paul uses the word sin not only to describe particular sins that we do, which is typically plural sins, but also sin as a power that binds us, from which we need not so much forgiveness as release, liberation from being bound by the power of sin. So just know this, that the word usually translated as forgive in the New Testament, aphiemi, that word means a lot of things. It means divorce if you're talking about marriage. It means release if you're talking about imprisonment. Only when it appears with the word sin do translators typically translate it forgive. But it means to be released from something. And it could be kind of a forensic idea that you have to be forgiven of guilt or wrong that you have done. But it could also be that you need to be liberated from the power of sin, maybe liberated from guilt, liberated from whatever the sin of Adam, whatever mark it left on the human condition. We need to be liberated from that. All creation groaning, waiting for liberation. This is Paul's view of sin, and it affects the world. Nature is bound by sin. That's why we have thorns, and that's why you have Alfred Lord Tennyson saying nature is red in tooth and claw. That's why you have nature that can be destructive at times. So in Paul's purview, sin is a big word. It's a binding force. It's a power. And it can also name the actions that we take when we're living under the bounds of sin, from which we need to be both released, liberated, but also forgiven. In the Gospels, if you believe, if your starting point is that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, we're all sinners in thought, word, and deed. We're all in need of forgiveness. If that's your beginning point, you can't really look at a group of people and say, "Oh, those are the sinners," right? Because that'd be like saying, "Oh, look at those humans over there," just like, well, look at the humans all around us. So in the Gospels, sinners tends to be used to describe. No one stops to explain it in the Gospels. We just have to look at how it's used, and it seems to be like notorious sinners. You know who they are, sinners, right? When they get together, you look at them and sinners. When it's used with relation to a woman, it almost always gets interpreted in commentaries as prostitute. And I don't know on what basis that assumption is made, but I think probably because the commentary writers are men. and that's all that's the go-to. So that's the curious one to me is a Pharisee is an office and an honorable office in many respects. And there are Pharisees who followed Jesus. They get some mention. And there are Pharisees today. Some Jewish leaders that you will meet will tell you, I'm a Pharisee. So don't go around just conking that word around like you think you know everything. They get offended at that. Um, but Pharisees was an office that someone studied for. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee. They did have it's kind of an interesting, road. The Pharisees did tend to be very strict in some respect, but they were also very progressive in some respect. Pharisees were largely the force behind all the synagogues that were established throughout Greater Palestine by the first century. So that's kind of decentralizing their faith from the temple in Jerusalem and empowering different communities to have their own synagogues. You don't see references to synagogues a lot in the Old Testament. This was a relatively innovative thing, and the Pharisees were largely behind that innovation, making sure that there were these teaching centers in every community where people had access to the law and the way of righteousness. So one can have a very positive perspective of the Pharisees if you look overall at what they did and how they did it. But it's true that in the Gospels, they tend to be the foils a lot of times, and they tend to be Jesus' opponents. There are moments where it will be said out loud. They begin thinking about how they could destroy Jesus. So the Gospel writers have a very low opinion of the Pharisees, and see the contention that Jesus had with them, and they center that a lot in the gospel story. And so we have to take that as that's how the story is told. But I don't want you to think that tells you the whole story of Pharisee. That makes sense? Likewise with the scribes. There was a lot to that. There were Christian scribes, and these are the folks who took the Gospel of Mark and copied it over the years, because a single parchment is not going to last forever. And so there are scribes throughout the years, and we're glad. Otherwise, we wouldn't have our compendium of scripture. So it's almost like we have to have two definitions. One is, what is a Pharisee generally? And Paul is never ashamed of having been a Pharisee. He actually says it was an achievement. What's a Pharisee generally? And who are the Pharisees in this story, in Luke's story? In general, there's a lot to admire. In the stories, they're the opponents of Jesus. Who are scribes generally? And who are scribes in the story? Who are tax collectors generally? And who are tax collectors in the story? Because generally, a tax collector would be a despised sort. But in the story, they're the ones always gathering around Jesus. And Jesus seems to like them. and that drives the righteous folk crazy. And then there's the question, what are sinners? Who are sinners? And you have to keep in mind the difference between Paul's theology and the gospel writer's theology. And what role do the sinners play in the story? And the role the sinners play in the story is that they come to Jesus. You remember the story that happens just before this moment, just before chapter 15. Remember how chapter 14 ended? It's that awful scripture we read last week in worship. Whoever does not hate their mother or father or spouse or children or siblings, or even their own life cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not take up the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not give up all their possessions cannot be my disciple. The very next thing we hear is that tax collectors and sinners gathered around Jesus. It makes you wonder if the indication is everybody else took off. These are hard words. And the fact that we're in a new chapter was somebody's addition later. When Luke is writing this story, the very next thing that happens is tax collectors and sinners gathered around Jesus. So they may be the folks who are willing to subordinate their loyalty to their parents, their spouse, children, sibling, and themselves in order to be with Jesus. All right, so you got these four folk. Let's keep some dynamic definitions going there. And the Pharisees and the scribes criticized Jesus for gathering with tax collectors and sinners. They're grumbling. They're grumbling. And the Greek word that Luke uses there is the one that shows up in the Septuagint. So when the Old Testament, which was mostly written in Hebrew, gets translated into Greek so that it can be more widely read after, the Greek Empire and all that. The book that was put together is called the Septuagint. It's signified by the Roman numerals for 70, and the idea that there were 70 scholars that translated it. And so it's the Old Testament in Greek. It's older than the New Testament. Most New Testament citations of the Old Testament are actually from the Septuagint. You can kind of tell because Hebrew language translates a little differently than Greek language. And it looks like they're citing the Septuagint. So it's probably the reading with which most of the biblical writers were most familiar. And whenever the Septuagint talks about the people of Israel who have just been liberated from slavery and spend 40 years in the wilderness, there are a lot of occasions where they begin murmuring. They're hungry and they murmur. It's just a hard word for me to forget. As a kid, the only thing I knew about the word murmur was that the people of Israel did that in the desert. They murmured, and God sent them manna. They murmured. They got tired of eating what they called this detestable food, talking about manna, and God sent them quail. They murmured because they were thirsty, and God caused water to come out of a rock. They murmured against Moses, and some of them actually died as a result. Okay, so that's one of the characteristics of how God's people are, is that they murmur against God and God's gifts and so forth. And that's the word that Luke is using here, that the Pharisees and the scribes were murmuring. This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. Notice verse 1 didn't say anything about eating, just gathering, but he eats with them. Okay, and that's why we have these two parables. Parable of the lost sheep, parable of the lost coin. Okay? So after we look at the parables, we'll circle back and say, how do verses 1 and 2 cause us to look at the parables in themselves? Okay, any questions to this point? Yes, Barry.
We pause just a minute. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them, implies that the eats with them is even more serious than welcoming them. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I'm currently doing a lot of writing on the Gospel of Mark, so I might get the two confused. But on the other occasions where the Pharisees particularly are critical of the disciples is over their eating habits, or what I call Jesus' table manners. They don't wash properly. They sit with the wrong people. And Jesus doesn't like their table manners because a chapter before, he told them, when you go to a meal, you always aim for the top seat, and you should rather go for the bottom seat. So the meal is where a lot of the practices, different practices, would be more evident. There's a proper way of washing. There's a proper decorum for who you sit with. And things like that.
And it's more intimate.
And what?
More intimate.
More intimate, and maybe even what you eat, but I don't know. That doesn't seem to be in play right here. That certainly will come into play in the book of Acts. when the church starts mingling with Gentiles. And remember, Peter's great vision is mingling with Gentiles is akin to eating unclean food. And what God has cleansed, you do not call unclean. That's a major story in Acts chapter 10. So yeah, the meal is where a lot of those different practices really became evident. Okay, so let's look at the first parable, the parable of the lost sheep. And I asked the question in the video. I really don't know the answer, although I have my suspicion. Jesus begins with a rhetorical question. And in our translation, the question mark appears at the end of verse 4. Punctuation was added to the scriptures later. They weren't there in the original text. I think that question mark might belong at the end of verse 6, that the whole parable might just be a long rhetorical question. But anyway, in verse 4, Jesus asked, how many of you, having 100 sheep and losing one, would not leave the 99 in the wilderness to go find the one that was lost? And as a rhetorical question, I'm describing it as that. There's an assumed answer with a rhetorical question. And so is the answer, well, any good shepherd would do that? Or is the answer, no shepherd in their right mind would do that? Which is the answer?
I don't think it's either or.
Okay, help us hold both of them then.
Well, my first consideration is whose audience is. And that he's trying to frame his ministry as going out beyond the Jewish tribe into the larger world. And so and in the back up just a little bit, the collectors and sinners and the Pharisees and scribes, that's on its face an adversarial stance. I mean, it's an adversarial setup. So I think in all of this, he's trying to neutralize that. And I mean, just as he said, you have to hate your family. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, you maybe value your mission more than staying home with family. And in this one, maybe you should stay with your sheep rather than going out again. So I think in a sense, he's trying to describe where he's going and how he's going. He's trying to bring his audience into some understanding of the dynamics of what's going on here. He's not literally asking them. And I think when he gets down to the sinners part, I just don't get the conclusion. It doesn't, for me, it doesn't follow. So, but that's ahead of stuff. So that's all.
When the original audience, the people for whom Jesus is actually talking in the story, when they hear the question, which of you would leave 99 and go find the one? Do you think they would assume it's either stay or go?
See,
or do you think
it's more symbolic? I don't think that's literally what it is. I think he's talking the 99, I think, is the Jewish tribe. And I think the one is the one who's gone out. And I think he's somewhat playing to his audience by saying, well, this is a sinner out here. And my job will be, as a good Jew, to bring them back into the fold. But I don't think that's where he's going. I think he's going toward broadening the whole idea of God's relationship to humanity. So I think he's a bit playing to his audience.
Okay. I feel that, mostly, I feel that more with Luke playing to his audience
Well,
than Jesus and his.
at all.
Yeah. I just, but
Not- you-
right. I think it's a great point. Yeah. Lydia, you were.
Well, I was just thinking about human nature and being a parent and a family system. We do go after our children when they stray. You know, even when they're doing bad things, we don't pay attention to the children who are doing everything just fine. We go try to help the one who is lost.
Yeah, that and that one ends up getting all the energy sometimes.
Right, I mean, so, but I don't know what he meant. Do you think he thought about families or?
Yeah, I don't know. This is the lovely thing about parables, right? They're not necessarily always allegories where everything represents something specifically, but they're always suggestive, like koans in some respects. They just kind of jar you into thinking otherwise. All right, anybody else? What do you think? Did the good shepherd stay or go? Go. A good shepherd's going to go.
I would go after my child who.
That's how.
When wherever I had to go to find him.
But you mean that you don't think that's really what he meant, because that's the more normal or common response, but that you think it was more sophisticated than that in his rhetoric in his question.
I don't know if I'm taking a side. I'm just saying it's an evocative rhetorical question, right? There's a similar question in the next parable that starts it. So when we get there, we'll kind of look back and see that. But 100 sheep, one's lost, 99 in the wilderness, one in danger. What do you do? Yes.
I was just thinking that if in fact you've lost something, there is a feeling of discomfort until you can find it.
Yeah.
So you go to great lengths to please locate it.
Right. Yeah, and I, if nothing else, this question focuses the grumbling. That look, under normal circumstances, yeah, maybe you get to choose your friends and maybe you get to be with those who you want, but you understand we're in a perilous situation here. There's a sheep that's lost. And it without being retrieved, it's going to die. It'll be lost for good. And so just the question itself ramps up, I think, the seriousness of this isn't just about who you're going to have dinner with. This is about whether you're going to let somebody be lost forever, or you're going to go to great lengths to bring them in. So yeah, I don't know if there's an answer to the question. Yes, John.
Well, it seems to me there's a difference between the two parables in that the woman who's looking for the silver coin, she's not putting anything else at risk. She's looking for the silver coin. The thing about what seems to be a rhetorical question, does anybody believe that they would not leave 99 sheep in the wilderness by themselves and therefore risk losing more than one sheep? I mean, it strikes me that the answer to that is not so clear.
Yeah. I'm that's why I'm asking, partly because I've heard some people just assume, of course, you go after the lost one. And I've heard some people just assume, but you can't leave 99 sheep in the wilderness, right? If a pack of hyenas come by, you're down to 73 sheep, that kind of a thing. So I think the question itself is in my reading, intended to trouble us into taking this situation much more direly and seriously than just eating with people. You know what I mean? There's life at stake. All right, so let's look at it. And but look at the language that when he finds it with joy, he takes it and lays it on his shoulders. and carries it back. And when he gets home, he calls together his friends and relatives and neighbors and says, "Rejoice with me. Rejoice, celebrate together with me." It's kind of redundant language. Celebrate together with me, for the sheep that was lost is found. Okay, and that's the end of the story, I think. And then you have the conclusion. Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Now, obviously, the sinner and the righteous persons in the parable are the lost sheep and the 99, right? More joy in heaven over the lost sheep that's found than over the 99 that never got lost in the first place. How's that working for you? Beryl shaking her head in a way that I hope she never looks at me and does. Well, what does that mean, Beryl? That
Sometimes parables don't help.
for our viewing audience, sometimes parables don't help very much. Yeah, okay. All right, that's the conclusion that Jesus gives. Okay, and then we go on to the next parable. All right, this one is different. It's a woman who has 10 coins.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Just when he rejoices, and I'm reading the next parable ahead. The lost son, they have a party and slaughter this fatted calf, and here we have the sheep. He says, "Come joyce and rejoice with me," and I can see the big party, and I can see this sheep, the smaller sheep being slaughtered, and he's back to 99 anyway.
Yeah.
Just as a different point, because it changes a little bit the function. In two of the interpretations I had, they say left in the wilderness. The sheep are left in the wilderness. The other two, one says open pasture, and the other one says something less harsh than the wilderness. So
My Bible says the
one's
open country.
One's open country and one's open pasture. The other two are left in the wilderness, and the wilderness would have a great deal more at risk. Somebody brought up the risk factor, whereas open pasture,
Yeah.
we've driven by up 395 up into June Lake area, and we've come across the shepherds.
Right.
That are out there, and they have their zones that are not fenced off and so forth.
Yeah.
So
So here's the word. It's the same word where Jesus goes out into the wilderness to pray.
Oh, okay.
Okay. It's certainly probably not a thick forested area. Like I think when I think of wilderness and, influenced by John Muir and so forth. It sometimes translated desert, but it's certainly not the Sahara. It just means it's not green. One reason your translators and or commentators are emphasizing that is because what they're interpreting in this story is that the danger to the 99 is not the issue. It's not that he endangered the 99. It's just that he wasn't searching for the 99 because they weren't lost. That's the same point in the second with the 9 coins that aren't lost, right? Sure. It's not that they're being mistreated or neglected or anything. It's just they're not the issue right now. So it is the word that can point to a lot of different landscapes, and it's really hard to translate with a single word that fits every time. It can mean kind of solitary space, more or less. So like a meadow or a lea or something like that, perhaps. Um, but I think the reason it's being translated softly, as it were, is because the peril of the 99 really is not the issue. If you look at the three parables together. And for a lot of people, it becomes the issue. And I think they're trying to steer us away from that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So he doesn't imperil the 99. He simply looks for the one. And doesn't, and that's the direction it goes. Yes, sir. Huh.
You know me from past. I'm thinking about the audience that Jesus was talking to that described it. And I'm not sure that many of the people hearing this parable really had any one-on-one experience with being a shepherd. Or like, so for them, the numbers don't become sheep in their head. It becomes what do I have? And what's necessary to make it whole again, to be 100 instead of 99 and one that's not there.
Right.
And then, yeah, that would be great. So, you know, it just, I don't know the answer. I think
Right.
that,
Yeah.
think about if I'd never had any experience with being around sheep and whatnot, and I was there at the time when Jesus told the story, I'd have to think, okay, yeah, whatever I have, if part of it is missing, and I have the experience and the ability and the knowledge to go looking and bring it back to the fold,
Right.
then I've gained something that's worthy of celebrating.
Right. Yeah. And that's a good point. And you know, Don, I have never been convinced at what the image of shepherd, what that communicated to Jesus' audience. Most studies show that very few people in that greater region were actually agriculturalists and pastoralists and so forth. Most of them had migrated to the cities. This was part of the Roman Empire's kind of way of reconstructing things, right? Large swaths of land were given to Romans. People ended up being sharecroppers on their family's historic land and so forth. So I suspect that a lot of the references in the New Testament, in the Gospels, to shepherds is appealing to an ideal as much as a reality. You know, everybody knows David was the good shepherd, and you know, everybody knows the 23rd Psalm and all those kinds of things. I'm sure they saw shepherds, sheep would be brought in for the market and all those kinds of things, but having firsthand experience of being shepherds, probably a very small percentage. Yeah. So you're dealing with probably an image more than a reality, but a powerful one, and one that's not totally alien to them like it is to me. I don't know a shepherd. Well, I know one, but she's retired now. But other than that, I don't know shepherds at all. And so they were closer than I am, obviously, but probably not as close as, say, all the patriarchs in the Old Testament had their crops and their livestock. But maybe that's why, and maybe that's why we have three parables, not one. We have three parables, and when it comes to sheep, the preciousness of one, I mean, it's not just a matter of, well, I need 100 to have my full contingency. The language of the shepherd rejoicing and putting it on his shoulders, to me, really speaks of some kind of care, if not fondness of some sort, right? But also this is true of coins, and with silver coins, the stakes are higher. One silver coin missing is a significant amount of money, especially for a widow or a woman. And when it comes to children, one of two children being lost is devastating, right? And so it broadens the whole thing from just shepherding in general. So let's look at the second one. We've got a woman having 10 silver coins, drachma. She loses one of them. And that's an important thing here. The shepherd never gets mad at the sheep for wandering off. He never blames the sheep. They never describe the sheep as being wayward. Okay? It's just the sheep that's lost. And so just like the emphasis does not seem to be that the 99 were left in peril, also we could say the emphasis does not seem to be that the one was a bad sheep. It was just lost. And doesn't seem to be blamed any more than that coin could be blamed for being lost. In fact, if anyone's to blame, the woman lost the coin. You know, she's probably kicking herself as much as one can do that. She lights a lamp, which means that I interpret that to mean there's some urgency to it. She's not waiting for the morning light. She's lighting a lamp. She's looking in every nook and cranny. She sweeps the entire house. I've always thought she might as well have a party since she's already cleaned up the house. But she sweeps the entire house. She's using a lamp, and she looked diligently until she finds it. And she finds it. And when she does, she rejoices. And she's not just happy. She's ready to celebrate with others. So this is another occasion where people are invited to share the joy. And the conclusion to that one, Jesus says, is just so I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. That's different than the first one. The first one says more joy over one sinner than the 99 that don't need repentance. And that's a little troubling. Kind of shucks for the 99 that don't need repentance. But in this one, we're not worried about comparing. It's just there's joy. There's joy in heaven over one sinner that repents. And again, those of us who pray, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If that's how it is in heaven, that's how it should be happening here with us. Okay, so what does the second parable do to your understanding of the first? Did it change it at all? If you'll notice, the second one also begins with a rhetorical question. What woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? So that too is a question. And the assumed answer to that is, of course she would. Which makes me think maybe the assumed answer to the first rhetorical question is, of course you'd leave the 99 to go find the one. If I'm looking for consistency. Okay. Questions, comments about the second? Yes.
I think he's raising the profile of the virtuous women by simply including them in its.
I agree entirely. Yeah. And in Luke's gospel, that happens a lot. I mean, Luke's gospel is a favorite among liberation theologians and feminist theologians because it does exactly that. More than the other gospels, but not the only gospel to do it, but more than the other gospels. Luke really raises up the kind of conditions that women face. My favorite story from Luke is chapter 18 of the widow who pesters the judge until she finally gets justice. If you're looking for a parable to give you strength in these times, that's it. She got no power. She only got the power of truth. And she repeats it over and over again till the judge says, this woman, she's giving me a black eye. That's the Greek word he uses for a black eye. She's pestering me. And even though I don't care about God or humans, I'm going to give her justice because she won't stop talking. And I'm thinking, there we are. Keep talking, y'all. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, Bill.
Like God, I think about the audience again.
Yeah.
If I'm sitting with the Pharisees and scribes, I feel a little left out in the second story. If I'm sitting with the sinners, then I'm feeling even better. If I can be one of those who repent. So, it's just a little bit different than the first
Yeah.
one.
So are the 99 mistreated? No. Are the 9 coins mistreated, so to speak? No, right? They don't need attention. They don't get the attention because they don't need the attention. I have found in myself, I'm just going to say this is in myself. And if you want to think I'm talking about society at large, that's your business. In myself, I have found that sometimes when I assume certain privileges and certain rights, and those privileges or those rights are being given to other people, I feel like I'm being slighted. Even though, I could just get along. I could just go about my business. I could just be fine. It almost feels like I'm being slighted. I almost feel like I'm being slighted when someone else gets a hand up that I don't necessarily even need. And I see that a lot today when you look at programs, affirmative action programs, and people call it reverse discrimination. Is it? I mean, sometimes you've never not gotten an interview simply because you're a white man. But many times people have not gotten interviews because they're not white or because they're not men. So affirmative action is not really about putting down white men as much as it is trying to lift up those who historically have been oppressed or put down.
Even it up,
I'm sorry?
at least even it up.
At least trying to give an even playing field in some way. But you will hear white men constantly, not every white man, but you will often hear white men say that this is a form of oppression against them, a reverse discrimination. And I don't think the way these stories are told that we need to feel sorry for the 99 or the 9 non-lost coins. But you will see in the third story, the son who was not lost. You'll see resentment in him. And his father will have none of it. His father doesn't play the game. This is my son. He was lost. Now he's found. He was dead. Now he's alive. Come celebrate. He just doesn't seem to have much sympathy for that argument. Okay, so let's go back to verses 1 and 2. Tax collectors and sinners are gathering around Jesus. Apparently, they're eating together. Pharisees and scribes are grumbling among themselves that this fellow welcomes those folks and eats with them. How does that opening context shape the way you hear the 2 parables that follow? How do the parables shape the way you hear that opening story? Is it all one cloth for Luke?
Because the sinners have come to Jesus and he's rejoicing.
And it's almost like you have a choice. You can either rejoice that these folks have gathered, or you can grumble. Rejoice or resent. I can't say much more, or else I'll have nothing left to preach on Sunday. Anybody else?
Well, one of them is very positive.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
one of them is very positive, a positive perspective, rejoicing. I mean, I like that one better.
Yeah.
It makes me feel better to think about that.
Yeah, I agree. When I was a youth minister in Georgia, I was going to college, and I was a youth minister at this little church, and I was out with a whole bunch of kids. We were playing softball, and this little girl, I can't remember her name, but she just had the greatest little Southern accent, and she was on one team, and her friend Travis was on the other team, and Travis got a hit. I mean, it just went right by her. She was little, went right by her. And she turned around, she stopped it. Great hit, Travis. And then she turned around and got the ball. And I thought, I want to be that kid right there. That my friend Travis, not that I didn't make the out, I didn't get him out, I didn't make the play, but my friend Travis got a hit. He must be so happy. I'm going to be happy with him. But typically we're in such an adversarial kind of stance to where his hit is my loss, right? And we feel it that way. So that's how I'm kind of going back to that first verse. Is those first two verses is what kind of disposition does someone need to have to see sinners and tax collectors with whom I've always had some justified suspicion, right? And maybe some resentment. See them gathering around Jesus. What does it take for me to celebrate that rather than resent that? And I'm saying me because I want you to think about you. What does it take for us to celebrate that and not resent that? All right, we're almost out of time. Let me look at the comments we have on our from our viewers here. Betty says, when we tell this story in the young children in worship, so that's to the smallest children in Sunday school, the shepherd doesn't notice a missing sheep until they're back in the sheepfold. How else would you count 100 sheep, she wonders. Could the standard practice be enclosing the sheep in the wilderness? And I don't know, Betty. It's a parable. But other way of making sense of leaving the 99 and noticing the one missing, it could have just been the one ram. Betty said that, not Mark.
I'm sheep are more important than I.
Betty said that, not Mark. I've always envisioned when I hear this parable that it's a fairly small sheep, because I mean a large sheep it'd be quite a Herculean task to throw that thing on your shoulders and carry it back. But I don't know. That's a great thing to ponder there, Betty. Okay. Any other comments, questions? What do you think? Yes, Shirley.
I love coming and going through this with you because I learned so much. But I think I grew up on the New Testament because all of the stuff we're talking about are what I listened to my father preach about.
Right.
And maybe differently than you. But this brought this back to me because I remember something that we were discussing, and I remember asking my dad why. I said, I've been a good person and a Christian all my life. I must have been 12 or 13 or 14. I says, and all of you are. And why does everybody get so excited about somebody who all of a sudden becomes a Christian? And it's the best thing that happened in the world. I remember talking to him about that. And I said, is he more important than us who are living this the whole time? And, I remember he more or less said to me, well, surely you've been living a good life all this time. You were lucky enough to be born into it. You know what it's about. We've tried to raise you right. But he said, not everybody grows up like that. So anytime good that happens to someone that comes along later, it doesn't take anything away from you and what you believe.
Yeah, and that's how the next parable ends. is the elder son doesn't want to celebrate.
No.
He's got a lot of resentment. And the father said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come back to life, was lost and has been found. So it's not an either or, right? Yeah. But man, I understand your resentment. And I think that's what makes these parables so powerful, both to us and to the original audiences. Yeah. Okay, it is 11:02, so we're going to stop the recording and thank those of you who have joined us here online. And we will do it again next week.
Are you doing well?
Thank you.
I got it.